So, hello and welcome to another episode of the Impact Room. I'm Holly Beeston, the Utilities Practice Lead here at Douglas Jackson, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Dr. Elizabeth Blakelock to this episode. So, welcome, Elizabeth.
It's brilliant to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
No problem at all. And Elizabeth, I'm hesitant to introduce you because you wear so many hats. So would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about some of the things that you're involved in currently?
Thank you. So I'm regulatory academic, so I do a lot of big picture thinking about what regulation could and should be doing in society. I also co-lead the UK Regulators Network Vulnerability Academy, which is an award-winning training course to make sure that people have the most up-to-date evidence about how to support consumers in vulnerable circumstances at their fingertips. And then I also work at the charity Citizens Advice. And of course, we do an extensive amount of engagement with regulators from across consumer sectors to make sure that people are really getting the best out of the markets that they need in essential services.
Wonderful. Lots of different things to keep you very busy. And thank you ever so much for agreeing to join me on our podcast, Elizabeth. I think the conversation peaked following your recent LinkedIn article, didn't it, around the value of potentially including a chief purpose officer within the regulators for the utilities sector. And that really resonated with me. Here at Douglas Jackson, we've done a lot around the purpose of a chief customer officer within lots of different sectors. And for myself, it's been within the utilities sector, and the early adopters of this are seeing a lot of value at that more strategic level. And I think at a time when consumer trust is at an all-time low for the sector, the utilities are regularly in the press, as we were talking about just before we started recording. I think the consideration of purpose is something that the regulators should really be considering having somebody within their executive team to work sort of strategically on the delivery of it. So I suppose for those that perhaps haven't seen, and I will link the article that you've created, but do you want to give a little bit of context and background behind your thinking on why you initially wrote that article?
Absolutely. So my observation is that it's been a really difficult couple of years to be a regulator. If you think about these organisations, they're set up in a very different time. And in fact, we'd call them economic regulators. So they're supposed to be focused on creating a market that has positive outcomes. Those are positive outcomes for people who are looking to invest in the country, but also positive outcomes for consumers. But we've had this series of crises, particularly in water and energy, where people are relying on these individual companies to deliver a safe and reliable service, not necessarily very snazzy, but we want safe water to drink that is not flooding our rivers and sea with waste. And we desperately need a warm, safe home, and we need those companies to work in a way that deliver that. But we know that companies need that oversight from a regulator to make sure they're sticking to the rules and making sure that those outcomes are happening. But then there's this kind of crisis response of, well, that's not what regulators do. Surely we're economic regulators. We think about the market. We're not necessarily thinking in a way that thinks about the public, that thinks about what society expects. And really, to me, it flagged this question of, well, do we actually agree as society what the purpose of regulation is? I know as a consumer advocate what I think the purpose of a regulator is. It's absolutely to protect members of the public and to make sure, yes, that we have the investment that we need in big infrastructure, but that's fair, the way that's financed is fair, and then that we have good outcomes for consumers, for members of the public who need these essential services. So who looks after purpose at a regulator? That was the question that was at the front of my mind. Who actually gets to decide what the core job is? What are the priorities? And when I look out beyond utilities, beyond regulation, that has been put into a leadership role for some organizations in a chief purpose officer. So a chief purpose officer, if for listeners who are not familiar, someone whose role it is to be at that executive board, to be the senior leader who owns the purpose of the organization. They're making sure that the purpose statement, that the vision, the mission, the values of the company are not just on a poster or even on a t-shirt. They're being lived and breathed, particularly in a time where, the values and mission of companies are part of their value in a financial way, because of course that's a real connection point for their customers. So you see firms, and some of the listeners might be familiar with the app Calm. It's a meditation app, and then very, very large international companies like Hasbro or PwC. They have chief purpose officers whose job is to be that senior level accountability for making sure that the purpose of their firm is really is actually having an impact. So that was the thought experiment that led me to the article. What would it be like if we had chief purpose officers in regulators? What if they had someone who was ultimately accountable for making sure that the expectations that we have as citizens, as members of society, as consumers, what if those expectations were being actively championed and there was accountability right at the top? And that's why I think it would be brilliant to see a chief purpose officer being brought into utility regulation.
I absolutely agree with you there. And I think the accountability piece is probably the most prevalent part of what you've brought in there. And I think there are a lot of organizations, a lot of regulators that it is part of their strategic thinking and it's continuously part of the conversation, but without the accountability, does it get lost sometimes, perhaps? And it's somebody to sort of keep bringing that back, a little bit like the sort of chief customer officer looks after customer in every guise. The chief purpose officer would have that accountability for making sure that the decisions made every step of the way were being brought back to that same mission and value. And that should essentially be the lifeblood of the business, shouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really important that we are agnostic in our thinking in terms of what regulators can learn from firms and what firms can learn from regulators in terms of the people. What are their what structures work for people, how can we make sure we get the best talent, how can we make sure that we're giving the right promotion opportunities for retention. All those questions. It doesn't matter if you're a civil servant or if you're in the private sector. Those are valuable and vital questions to be asking. And of course, having a vision, a clear mission, and lived values, it's very compelling to people who kind of join organizations, whether they're regulators or firms. So if you had a chief purpose officer who was right at the top, making sure those vision, mission, and values were at the heart of regulation, then you get those benefits of people coming to the organization who share those values. I think in preparation for this podcast, I had to think about kind of a parallel track of what my year might have been like last year if the regulators who I work with had a chief purpose officer. So we are still in a crisis situation with people who simply can't afford to pay their bills. Now, I work mostly in energy on that topic, but that's absolutely the case. So at Citizens Advice, we know that 1 in 4 people simply can't afford their essential bills, energy and beyond. We've got this huge cohort of people who desperately need the essentials, and they need their essential service firms to engage with them in a compassionate way to help them understand how they can afford to pay for their essential services, particularly, unfortunately, around debt now. So many people who are really struggling with that. So they need firms to set up a sustainable debt repayment plan rather than chase it aggressively. And regulators play a really vital role in making sure that the debt collection is done fairly, it's done transparently, and it's done in line with the rules. There are already rules that have been on the book before this cost of living crisis.
Yeah.
So we ended up doing some incredibly quick, very intense, urgent crisis management, incredibly reactive. And by the end of last year, you saw very firm consumer protections brought in energy around debt collection, customer service, and particularly around the forcing of prepayment meters, because we had a big crisis, people who simply can't afford to top up their prepayment meter being forced onto meters. Now, the crisis in terms of people struggling to top up, I'm afraid that's still going on, but at least we know that new people won't be being forced onto a prepayment meter if it's not safe for them to be on one. So what difference might a chief purpose officer have made in that situation? Well, it's my belief that if we had someone in a leadership position who was empowered by the board, by the executive team, to be proactively working to make sure that consumer protection was at the heart of what the regulator did, that there would have been a very different approach to proactively identifying the crisis and acting early to make sure that the rules were sufficient to make sure that firms weren't acting in a very aggressive way that caused consumer harm. So if you had that very senior person who could be there making the case that there is an expectation by the public that regulators protect consumers, and therefore we need exceptional reporting on what's happening on the ground. We need to make sure that we're working very closely with charities and consumer groups who talk to people every day. We need to understand their experiences, and we need to be proactively looking at the rule book to ask the question, are these rules working for the people that we're supposed to be protecting? And it's my belief that if we had that senior person proactively looking at those issues, then we would have seen much more swifter action and much earlier action that could have actually helped prevent the harm that we did see unfold, especially around the prepayment crisis in 2023.
And I think as well, when you're talking about sort of communicating with the organisations that are delivering these essential services as well, it's really important to keep those lines of communication open about these imperative topics, whether that be vulnerability, whether it be around payments, whether it be around how we protect customers in the future. It's so important to make sure that there is that empathy and clarity over the direction in which, not just the direction, I suppose the parameters in which people are able to sort of work and deliver these services. And with a chief purpose officer, there's this sustainability piece. There's, in some of the larger organizations that do employ them, it goes back to their sort of ESG agendas. And so actually, when you're looking at the regulators that are there to guide the sector, it's imperative that we're looking at ways to be preventative versus reactive, like you say.
Absolutely. And I've been talking about the cost of living crisis and how we could have been more proactive there. But I think looking ahead, this is also something incredibly important when we think about having a vision of the role of regulation that really reflects the needs of the public. We're looking at topics like the transition to net zero. A fair transition to net zero it needs to include far more than the kind of traditional thinking of economic regulation from the 80s and 90s. This is a very different world where we need to be looking at society and the impact that climate change could have on all of our lives, and therefore a very different type of regulation, particularly in energy and water, in terms of thinking about how we get that. I mean, you started the podcast to talk about trust, how we get the trust for people to then be able to engage in the new products and propositions that mean that the net zero society is really going to be available and accessible to the number of people it needs to be if
Mm.
it's going to be successful. I mean, the extent of the changes that everyone will have to make to their homes to make them energy efficient, and therefore so we can reach our net zero targets, are very significant. And that is a very different world than a regulator who says, right, you need to make sure that these 3 bits of information are on a bill. That's behavior change. It's very challenging, and the way that firms engage with their customers is going to need to be regulated in a very different way. We're going to need to think far more about innovation, about engagement, and in a way that is often quite new to some of the more
Mm.
traditional utilities that you and I work with every day.
Of course. And I think going back to the trust piece, it's about educating all of the different stakeholders that are involved in these processes when you're bringing new products and ideas to the general consumer. If they're not doing the levels of research that are being done by the regulator, by the utility provider, and suddenly there's a huge investment. We've looked at lots of things, haven't we, around solar panels, heat pumps, EV cars and chargers. It's all very scary and there's a lot of investment. And like you say, there are 1 in 4, did you say, people in the UK at the moment?
You just can't meet their essential service bills. Yeah, that's
So that
people who come to citizens' advice.
so when you look at, that's 25% of the population that are hearing about all of these net zero plans, but the reality is they're having to make those decisions between eating and heating. So how, again, how do you rewrite the playbook essentially for them to understand what the value is longer term when actually they are probably struggling themselves to see what's going to happen in the next month for their personal situation? And I think there's a big empathy piece here as well, isn't there? And perhaps I know that when we sort of talked following on from me reading your um, initial article, we talked around diversity of thinking at that leadership level and at exec level, individuals that can empathize with the fact that they know of somebody or have personally been in a vulnerable circumstance themselves. And a lot of the time, that's not the case with execs in any sector. But how do you then generate the empathy to be able to talk on the same level as those consumers for them to really understand what the value is of investment in future product lines and growth of these organizations? And does that again come back to the regulator being that more trusted voice that can say, this is the full explanation as to why we need to invest in these things for the future and for generations in the future too?
Mm-hmm. So when I think of the 1 in 4 people who are coming to citizens' advice who can't make ends meet, they can't afford their essential bills, they're often the people who would benefit most from being able to access the changes to their home, particularly around loft insulation to keep
Mm.
them warm and safe at home. They are some of the people who would benefit most from engaging with their firm to then get, for example, the water social tariff.
Mm.
So what can the regulator with a clearer accountability around purpose play in that? Well, I feel that if we had a chief purpose officer really driving the consumer protection agenda, really thinking about what the regulator's role in delivering those outcomes could and should be, then they
Mm.
would be the person championing understanding the experiences of those people and the way that firms can really support them and make sure that they do have access to the essential services that they need. And that link to diversity is a fascinating one. We do collect data across the utilities around diversity. And I think it's safe to say that in whichever utility sector you're in, there's a lot of work to do at that very senior level to get diversity, not just in terms of demographic diversity, but in terms of diversity of thought. And
Yeah.
as you say, have you ever had that kind of financial struggle? Does anyone you know currently having that financial struggle? It's relatively unlikely at the moment. I think I can say that without the data in front of me. So it gives us that opportunity to think, well, if we are seriously rethinking what the C-suite looks like, you and I talking about chief purpose officers, chief customer experience officers, if we've got these people around the table, that gives us really an opportunity to rethink what does a C-suite look and feel like.
Yeah.
Because we know that people have and this is universal, unconscious biases around what they expect a certain job role to look like. So there is an expectation of what a CEO looks like. There's an expectation of what a chief financial officer looks like. And if you go to a conference in the utilities that's got CEO speakers, you can see that they all look pretty similar, and are demographically pretty similar. But if we had a new view of new roles, then of course those biases and assumptions aren't there. So I think that there's something really interesting around, if you're bringing in new roles into the C-suite, does that mean that you have fewer of those biases to battle against? And perhaps we might see a bit more diversity at that very senior level.
And is there less of an expectation for individuals to be educated to a certain level? Because actually the diversity of thinking might be that we talk about sort of the university of life sometimes, don't we? And is it that it's lived experiences that sort of earn that credibility to have that voice at a table, rather than you have to have gone and studied a high level degree or a doctorate, or are we missing a trick here by having that sort of blanket expectation of this is what you absolutely have to do? Before there are billionaires that have no education, that run very successful businesses, but they build their team around the weaknesses that they have. And is, like you say, is this the opportunity to create a new role, create a new way of thinking, and to be really open with what that individual looks like and what their background is?
So I feel like I'm edging out of my area of expertise and into yours. So it's fascinating to hear your thinking. I think that there's two things though that crop up for me as I hear you speak. That we talk and think a lot about kind of talent pipelines. Of course, it's all very well saying, right, we're going to have a chief purpose officer and you don't need a university degree. But we know that the civil service fast track, for example, has a particular demographic. So what's going in at the front of the talent pipeline, and how does it translate into who then many years later is available for a new C-suite role? But I've seen some really interesting steps taking that area. So, for example, it's the norm more and more now to anonymize the name of the university you're at, to try and overcome the biases that are associated with particular universities. And I know that some of the very large consulting firms, Big Four, there have been a series of experiments around not needing a degree and bringing people on after their A levels. So I haven't seen the data on this, but I've read several articles about how successful that's been, because people have been focused on delivery of the kinds of projects they would do in work, and there's no unlearning needed about what that looks or feels like. What good research means in the workplace might be quite different to what you've learned at university. And if you don't have to unlearn it, you can just get cracking with the way things are done in a particular business. So it's definitely, there's things to look up and to check out around the firms and the organizations that are really trying new things. And I know that the civil service has explicitly included that have started to much more explicitly consider class in terms of their diversity demographics, as well as gender, as well as ethnicity, as well as disability. So things like the education of parents, income, that kind of thing, to try and really grasp the nettle in terms of making sure there's a diversity of thought. Because of course we know that diversity leads to much better productivity, much more innovation, and that's exactly what we need in the utilities, and certainly what we need in terms of leadership at regulators as we tackle these very large problems and we think about how to get much better outcomes for consumers and the public.
Absolutely, and it stops the entryway to a C-suite role requiring a certain tick box of experiences along the way. Nobody's career path is particularly linear. There's lots of exposure to lots of different areas and businesses and issues to overcome. If you think about working in the utility sector for probably the last 4 or 5 years now, there have been a number of challenges that nobody could have foreseen or planned for. And actually, there are a lot of incredibly talented people across the sector that do deserve the opportunity for progression. And it's important to then make sure that those people aren't going outside of the sector and adding the value that they've learned here into another area when there's so much that can be built upon from what's been learned over the last few years as well. So yeah, like you said to me the other day, it's that sort of rocket fuel, I suppose, behind the chief purpose officer role that will make those values both lived and breathed at board level. There's no chance of it losing momentum then, is there?
Absolutely. And when I think about the approaches that have been experimented with in terms of getting those positive outcomes, it's really interesting to watch the development of the financial services in line with the consumer duty, really taking outcomes very seriously and expecting firms to be proactively monitoring, proactively making sure that the vision, the mission, the values, which are on their branding as organisations, are actually making their way through, and the regulator is seeing those outcomes. So I think that there's something really interesting about this shift to outcomes-based regulation that's based on a consumer duty that could be really positively linked with that senior accountability of a chief purpose officer, because ultimately that seems to be one of the most successful ways of regulating to get those consumer protection outcomes is a consumer duty. And that's certainly something that I would like to see spread across the utilities in terms of regulation. And I wonder if a chief purpose officer might be able to be that champion of the best outcomes, looking after the consumer duty and making sure that consumers are prioritised and members of the public are protected.
There's certainly a lot of thought that comes out of this idea really as well, Elizabeth. And I think for me, one of the things that sort of resonates from what you've just discussed is we've done a lot of let's write this down and this is what we're going to abide by. And there's a lot of talking, a lot of things written, but the difference, I think, from what I've seen happen in the financial services industry with consumer duty through colleagues is that the words have turned into action.
Mm-hmm.
And there's accountability, and the action needs to be replayed back. So there's an accountability. And like you say, is that where the chief purpose officer comes in the utility sector?
I suppose if I had kind of a final thought to wrap us up, it would be that whatever happens next, whether it's a chief purpose officer or a take up more widely of the consumer duty and outcomes in a different way in the C-suite, the public are demanding better accountability at regulators. There is no scenario where we carry on as we have been. We need these essential services to live. And that means there are very high expectations around consumer protection. So something's got to change. And I think the C-suite is somewhere that we might start.
I totally agree with you there. And I really, really appreciate you joining us today on the Impact Room to discuss this. And I think this is just the start of the conversation, isn't it? And I know that you'll always welcome a conversation to further this, as will I. But thank you so much for coming on and sharing your thoughts, Elizabeth. It's been a pleasure to have you.
Fantastic. Thank you again for the invitation. It's been a brilliant way to spend some time this morning.
Thank you.